CEE,
Central Europe Explained,
an IDM podcast series
powered by Erste Group.
Episode 26, Healing the Economy, the European Silk Road, Cooperation and Recovery in CEE. Hello and welcome to another episode of Central Europe Explained. Today we will talk about healing the economy, the European Silk Road. In 2018, a study by the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, wiiw, proposed the European Silk Road as a response to China's new Silk Road. By connecting the industrial centers in the West with the populous but less developed regions in the east of the continent, it is argued to generate more growth and employment. The study finds that the development of a European Silk Road could create 2 to 7 million new jobs and could increase GDP on average by 3.5% in wider Europe over a 10-year period. Eastern Europe in particular needs an upgrading of its transport infrastructure. Today, we will be talking to Dr. Mario Holzner, Executive Director of the wiiw and co-author of the study. Mario, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
As a start, how is the overall economic situation in the CEE region during the COVID-19 pandemic? And has the EU learned from the financial and economic crisis 2007 and 2008 with regards to healing the economy?
Well, I wouldn't say that it is great, but nevertheless, by comparison, it could be worse. Let's put it that way. There are a few reasons for that. One reason is that the region has a much lower share of services sector in its economic structure. And given that the pandemic was affecting particularly the service sector and less so manufacturing, this is one reason why economy-wise, the GDP development was not that bad in Central, East and Southeast Europe. There are a few exceptions. Obviously, those countries very much dependent on tourism, for instance, like Croatia and Montenegro, fared much worse. But on average, the reductions in GDP were smaller and the recovery is interestingly also better. Why is the recovery better? Well, partly also because most of these countries did not have this stringency in measures against the COVID as compared to Western Europe. So if you wish, one could argue that they were sacrificing health, public health, for better growth. And another reason is that the countries still are less developed than Western Europe, and hence growth rates are still higher in any case. And there is also, at least for those countries, members in the European Union, there are also transfers that support growth, even in periods when maybe the private sector would not invest. EU transfers go directly into gross fixed capital formation, i.e. investment. So these are more or less the main reasons. And I think overall, not only Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe profits from a better crisis management in the EU overall, as compared, for instance, to the global financial crisis. I think lessons have been learned to a large extent, definitely on the monetary policy front. I think the activities of the ECB are very important to support growth, or at least to avoid worse outcomes in economic terms throughout Europe. There have been also programs for non-Euro countries, some swaps and what have you. So providing liquidity also to the neighbors was a very good idea, helped a lot. And but also on the fiscal policy front, we have learned. So there is no austerity at the moment. On the contrary, big fiscal packages on the European level support, if nothing else, then on a psychological level, wider Europe, and provides some sort of positive outlook for economic development in the years to come, which is very important for private agents to plan and to invest themselves maybe in the near future as well.
Now, as a reaction to the pandemic in the new multi-annual financial framework, there is also the mechanism of the EU Recovery Fund. And could you tell us a little bit more what we could expect where the CEE region would benefit from this new mechanism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, benefits for wider Europe are, again, similar to what I have said just before. I think there is this is a mass psychological argument. There is some sort of willingness on the side of the EU to do something about recovery, to invest in important areas of investment for the future. So I think a third of the funds must be used for the green transition. 10% of the funds, if I'm correct, used for the digital transition. So highly important issues, not only in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe. And in addition to that, the relative importance of these transfers are particularly high in the poorest countries of Central and Eastern Europe that are EU member states. We have to remember that those countries that are not EU member states will not really receive comparable funds. But those who are, and a large chunk of these countries are already EU members, will profit. And here especially, as I said, the poorest ones, so Bulgaria, Croatia, Romania, will gain a lot, at least from what we know are the earmarked funds. Now, it is a different question whether these countries will have the capacities to actually really materialize investment supported by these funds. And I think that will be the crucial thing to look at in the years to come. And hopefully also the Commission will help maybe to facilitate projects and really make these funds being available to the states, to the municipalities on different levels, partly also to private actors, and yeah, hopefully a large share of it will really find its way into those economies. However, there are good reasons to believe that there might be problems. So this is something that also policymakers in the region have to take care of.
You mentioned the green transition. One of the biggest projects of the European Commission is the European Green Deal. Now, your idea of the European Silk Road, which dates back to 2018, way before that Green Deal was presented and way before the current situation emerged, seems to have a lot of possibilities to connect with this Green Deal. Can you tell us a little bit more about your study and the possibilities here?
Indeed, at the core of our suggested European Silk Road is a high-speed rail network that stretches on the northern and the southern route. The core line would be something between Lyon, going all the way through the main metropolitan areas in northern parts of continental Europe, all the way to Moscow, connecting really the big metropolis, with extensions southwest all the way to Lisbon, in the east all the way to the Kazakh border, and a southern route from northern Italy through southern Germany and the Danube Valley all the way to the Black Sea, and with sea link extensions also into the southern Russian and the southern Caucasian areas. But I mean, clearly these are, if you wish, colorful lines on a map. The core idea really is to probably start first in central member states of the Union, something between Paris and Berlin, trying to connect them, as I said, with high-speed rail networks. It would be an important measure to fulfill the Paris climate goals. The Union should reduce 90% emissions in transport sector, and an essential issue will be to reduce particularly air transport, which which is very much behind a large chunk of the emissions. How can you reduce that? Well, one possibility would be to move to high-speed rail. The technology is actually quite an old one. And while Europe has been jumping from one crisis into the other, partly also self-inflicted with the austerity, 2011, for instance, China has been building now roughly 80% of the world's high-speed rail network. And there is also a very interesting study by the European Court of Auditors about the European high-speed rail network, and they really say there is none. There are only a few national attempts, like the TGV system in France and Talgo in Spain, on certain lines like Barcelona, Madrid, and I don't know, Paris, Marseille, and so on. And maybe there are a few extensions that cross border, but in essence, there is no European network. So what we really suggest is a project with EU value added, with European value added, crossing many, many borders. And it is clear this is extremely difficult to be built. If at all, I guess, and our suggestion goes to have one European Silk Road Trust, a big company that would issue bonds, and there could be public guarantees for those bonds, and those could help to actually construct and operate something like that. As you said, in 2018, we had a study that looked at the costs of such a project and the economic effects. In 2019, we had another study that looked at the organizational issues to be taken care of, particularly also the financing. And we had then also a study in 2020 together with our sister institutes, the IMK in Düsseldorf and the OFC in Paris, part of the Sciences Po, where we reiterated the idea. And most recently now, we have a study with colleagues from the Central European University where we actually calculated the effects on CO2 emissions of the introduction of the core line from Lyon to Moscow, and we come up with CO2 emission savings of roughly 10% of a year in the EU. This is not a lot. This is taking into account 60 years of operation of such a high-speed rail line. However, it's not nothing, and also we only looked at the passenger transport. If you would take care of freight transport, probably double the amount of CO2 could be saved, and so on. And obviously, if you have a bigger network, more could be done. We know basically that it is essential to cut travel times to below 4 hours. That is kind of a magic border. If you are below 4 hours, you will have quite a big chunk of passengers going away from plane to train. And hence relations on routes of around up to 1,000 kilometers. If you have a train that is on average going 250 to 300 kilometers per hour, then you have good chances to actually have this modal shift away from plane to train. And I think that is something that we have to do now very soon and invest in fast trains.
Do you think that the current situation that arises through the pandemic builds a momentum for this, that there is an additional awareness for the necessity of this transition? Because when we look at the liberalization of the train market and operational, but also producing the tracks on a European level, and these initiatives have been undergoing for quite some time. We have 3 and 4 railway packages that have been adopted, but it has not led to this further investment, and especially fostering cross-border train transport, be it persons or freight.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. The strategy so far was very much looking for efficiency gains. And to some extent, in some areas, this was actually happening. For instance, in the services that are offered on trains, like Wi-Fi and so on. State monopolists before said, no way, this won't work and so on. But competition helped to improve those services, maybe, at least on the main lines. However, in many other ways, these reforms were not very helpful, and it actually led partly to a further increase of various standards. All these private companies have different security standards and what have you. And exactly, we should actually have a big European market, maybe with a few competitors, but whether it really makes sense on the national level to have different competitors. I mean, the private sector will basically look at the 2 or 3 main lines which are profitable, and the rest will not be really gaining from this. So I think we really have to think now big in European terms. And I think there has been also, with the help of the pandemic, which showed to us very much how connected, in fact, we all are. Once we lose the connections, we see that we actually miss them, and that we're actually quite strong, and that we have to do something about that, and also think beyond the current crisis, which I'm sure will end one day. We might still see the last wave being maybe the most worrisome, but I hope that next summer the situation will improve dramatically, and that we might find a way out of this pandemic. And then we have a lot of other problems. Then we have very high levels of indebtedness. We will see the necessity to generate growth. But we know, and I think by now also new generations of politicians are in power, we know that we have to do something about the climate change issue and digital transformation and a number of other things, and that we need to grow out of this crisis, and we need to do green investment in order to facilitate the fight against climate change, because I think the zero growth option is not a politically viable option that we have, and hence there is really a necessity to do this. And I think there is really now a change in the overall picture that might have been, again, facilitated by the pandemic.
When there are big and drastic changes proposed, you almost always are automatically facing reserved reactions, especially in politics. Now you have a very big proposal, and I think a very great potential for development in this. However, can you tell us a little bit about the feedback that you have received, especially when it comes maybe to certain member states? Because I could imagine that this interconnectedness is still not something where each and every government sees the benefits of fostering cross-border high-speed connections.
Clearly, there are very different reactions to this proposal, which on the one hand can be seen as a very utopian proposal. On the other hand, given that there are examples that exist, but these things were built, it's not completely impossible. It's interesting to note, for instance, within the European Commission, maybe the old parts of the Commission, obviously those people who have been dealing with the trans-European networks that are there since the 1990s, and I mean that are really important support for creating transport networks in Europe. But these are piecemeal investments. The funds so far also have not been huge. I think since the pandemic, we really started to think in trillions and not anymore in millions and billions. We started to think in a dimension that is relevant for the whole continent, or at least for the European Union. And that is a difference to earlier times. And I have to say, the politicians we have been contacting, they come from all political groups, basically, the full spectrum, where we found supporters. We particularly try to target German and French politicians also, given that these are the biggest member states. Obviously, if this should fly, then France and Germany have to support it. Fairly good reactions, I think, also supported by some colleagues who were writing newspaper articles on this. We had a panel in Brussels when we presented the second paper in late 2019. And that was very fruitful discussion. And just a few weeks later, there was an editorial in the Financial Times that was very positive and supporting our suggestion, which made us very proud and gave us the power to go on and continue with this. And as I said, we had another publication jointly with the French and the German Institute and in 2020, and now most recently with the CEU colleagues on this very important issue of the emission effects. And we will continue with colleagues from the CEU also next year, where we will look more into the freight transport issue. So we will continue with this. We see a lot of positive response also in media. I mean, we are a non-profit organization. We are not a huge institute, so we do this pro bono. So our resources are limited, but there are also others who support us and who want to do something about it. And we are obviously happy to cooperate also with anyone who wants to join forces.
Mario, thank you so much. I think especially in these times, utopias are necessary, and the utopia of a European Silk Road has a lot of potential to become a reality. It has a lot of benefits. We learned a lot about it. I think we should continue to see how this development goes. We have the links to the study in the show notes of this episode, but at the end of the episode, we always ask for a piece of art or literature that is connected to this topic. And I would also like to ask you if you have a recommendation for us.
Maybe not a particular concrete piece, but there is a colleague, he's a conductor, and he organizes the Silk Road Symphony Orchestra. You can look up his website also. And a number of other initiatives around music. And I think, as you mentioned, part of the utopia of a European Silk Road is also that it is not only about economics, it's not only maybe about climate and other very material issues. It's also simply about connecting people across Europe. Also people who are in the cultural business, musicians, painters, whoever, bring people closer together. And one has to say that Europe has lost a little bit of its narrative. It was, the EU was meant to be a peace project after the horrible situation after the Second World War, but the generations that have lived and experienced the Second World War or the immediate effects of it, partly they don't exist anymore, and so we need maybe a new narrative. And I think a big common European mission like the European Silk Road could be one of those narratives that could bring us together. And in that sense also music and cultural activities along a European Silk Road are very much welcome.
Thank you very much. I think this is a wonderful recommendation. We will put the link also in the show notes. Mario, once again, thank you very much for joining us today and talking about your project, and all the best for the future development.
Thank you very much.
So you enjoyed this podcast? Then tune into another CEE episode and subscribe to the IDM podcast series on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Acast, or elsewhere you get your podcast. And also have a look at the rest of our work on our website www.idm.at. For any feedback or podcast collaboration, feel free to contact me at e.honteberry@idm.at. The email is in the description below. This was CEE, Central Europe Explained, a podcast series produced by the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe, powered by Erste Group, with the ongoing participation of Daniela Paiden, Malvin Natalik, Daniel Martinek, and Sebastian Schäffer. Production and editing, Emma Honteberry. Proofreading, Jack Gill. IDM Podcast.
Institut für den Donauraum und Mitteleuropa.
Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe.
European perspectives.
Regional actions.
Cooperation and expertise since 1953.